Hi, people. So it was my birthday, my 37th birthday on the 1st of September. I would have made the video then, but I was engaged. I want to say a few words on Mikhail Gorbachev, who has passed away on the 30th of August at the age of 91. Just going to show you the cover of the Metro newspaper here in the UK. World mourns a true man of peace. And this is the Times. Gorbachev, USSR's last leader, dies at 91. Um, this was a big story because Mikhail Gorbachev, I think it's no exaggeration to say, one of the most important figures of the late 20th century, certainly of my lifetime. Um, his actual period in office wasn't very long. It was about 6 years altogether in under various titles. I'm just going to read them off actually from the Wikipedia article. Um, from 1985 to 1991, March 85 to August 91, so a period of just over 6 years. He was General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. From May 1989 to March 1990, he was Chairman of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. And from 1990 to 1991, he was President of the Soviet Union. He stepped down on Christmas Day, 1991. I was watching one of my favorite episodes of The X Files the other day. If you follow The X Files, the episode is called Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man. Um, the character played by William B. Davies. It's a great episode. It very much taps into the whole conspiracy theory realm, which The X Files is known for. But at one point, cigarette smoking man, cancer man, as he's known in the show, gets his facts, and it just says Gorbachev has resigned. And then he says, no more enemies, or one of his colleagues says, no more enemies, the Cold War is over. Um, and it's quite something. I think it's with the world the way it is right now, everything that's been happening with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it seems like a very different time, the sort of late 80s and early 90s, that period of real optimism. It wasn't totally bloodless. The revolution in Romania was violent. And in 1991, as a kind of last act of force, the protests in Lithuania were put down, and I believe a number of people were killed in that. Um, so Gorbachev is one of those figures that is very, very interesting. In Russia, I say Russia because, of course, the old bloc is gone, but in Russia, Gorbachev remains a highly controversial and actually unpopular figure. And it's an interesting case of being more popular abroad than at home. Um, I mean, this man changed history. Yes, it's true that Thatcherism and Reaganism very much shaped the 80s. And there were other important figures at the time, Pope John Paul II, Helmut Kohl. But ultimately, it did come down to Gorbachev. In ending the Cold War. Because without the reforms that he made, Glasnost and Perestroika, there could have been a Russian civil war. I don't think. I think Gorbachev knew that that was not a feasible option. There was the 1991 coup against his rule and the 1993 Russian constitutional crisis. No love lost between Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev. Um, Sometimes in the lionizing of Gorbachev in the West, we forget this man was a dedicated communist for years. Um, and although now he's seen as, by communist standards, I guess, a liberal, he was a dedicated communist. He was very much part of that system. But he was also a pragmatist. I mean, when he came in the mid 80s, well, the year I was born, he was relatively young by Politburo standard, 54. If we look at what happened, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko had all died in succession. They were all old men. Um, and so it's easy to see why Gorbachev was seen as a fresh face. He smiled. He was media savvy. He was a man, as Margaret Thatcher put it, that you could work with. So fascinating figure. But of course, under Putinism, this nationalism has sort of become the new religion in Russia. And Gorbachev seen as a traitor. Apparently, he was very distressed by the situation in Ukraine. He rarely vocalized outright condemnation of Putinism. I think he was definitely uneasy about it. He's not going to get a state funeral. Putin, of course, has made the kind of, I guess, routine condolences, but it's definitely crocodile tears. I mean, the vision that these two men had couldn't be more different. Gorbachev was a pragmatist who knew that this situation couldn't go on forever, that the Cold War was coming to an end, and that if resigning prevented civil war, then that was what he had to do. He actually said treachery destroyed the Soviet Union. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. I haven't read the full obituary in the Times yet. They always do good obituaries. Um, but Putin is an irredentist. The whole thing about Ukraine, I mean, of course, the excuse the Russians have used is about defeating fascism, but really it's about irredentism. This idea that Russia was humiliated, and never mind the Soviet Union, I think Putin actually wants to regain the Tsarist Empire. He's an ultranationalist and he sees this as the humiliation by the West. Um, Ukrainians are paying the price in their thousands, as are young Russian soldiers. Um, it's a coincidence. I was watching a documentary about Putin with my dad the night Gorbachev died. I only found out the next day. My mum sent me a message and I hadn't seen the news that day. But I'm thinking, like in recent years, well, he's really the last big figure of the Cold War, like major leader. Helmut Kohl passed away George H.W. Bush in 2018, Helmut Kohl 2017, Margaret Thatcher 2013, Pope John Paul II 2005, and Ronald Reagan in 2004. So that's it. All those big figures of the great powers are gone now. What do we have? We have an aggressive ultra-nationalistic Russia under Putin. We have a very dangerous situation at Zaporizhia. If that thing goes up, it's going to be bigger than Chernobyl. I think we're in a dangerous time. And I think the only way it ends is, frankly, with the death of Putin, either from natural causes or if he's toppled in some sort of internal coup. It might well be that the Ukrainians get the upper hand militarily, and the war will wind down, but it won't end. It will. One top Ukrainian advisor, apparently to President Zelensky, has said that it could end up in a Cold War type stalemate for years, and it will only end when Putin goes. Given the history of Russia, I don't see a peaceful transfer of power. I think Putin is either going to die of natural causes, um, well, then there will be a kind of succession crisis, or there'll be some sort of internal coup. Um, but someone like Putin isn't going to go out quietly. One of the things that came about in that documentary I was watching with my dad was that he looked at what happened in Arabian Spring, and apparently Putin was actually planning on stepping down. But he saw these strongmen dictators, so called, the likes of Mubarak, in Egypt, not Assad. Assad is obviously been propped up by Russia, but Mubarak and Gaddafi toppled. And he saw this was, there was this democratic spirit in the early 2010s, a bit like the late 80s. Of course, the sad thing is, unlike the late 80s in Eastern Europe, Arab Spring became Arab Winter. Um, but, I think in the West we have to understand why Gorbachev was hated in Russia. It wasn't just that he was seen as treacherous. I think Russians associate Gorbachev and Yeltsin with a sort of breakdown of society. So Gorbachev was the man who kind of gave up the Soviet Union as they see it. Yeltsin was the man who allowed corruption and crime to spiral out of control. Putin was the man who stabilized it. So, as much as Putin is a tyrant and deserves all the condemnation to history that he gets, it's easy to see why Putin has power in Russia. It's not a surprise to me. Hell, in the early 2000s, it's even understandable that Russians supported him. But I think it's accurate to say that the Kremlin today really operates like a mafia outfit. It's almost like the world's most powerful mafia family. Um, I mean, the corruption in Russia is just on another scale. It's unimaginable. Um, and so passing of Gorbachev is really perhaps, I don't know, it's perhaps a warning about optimism, which sounds cynical, but in those months and years of the late 80s and early 90s, there really was a lot of optimism. I mean, the fall of the wall, which Putin saw as a great tragedy, for those of us who believe in liberal democracy, that was a wonderful moment. You know, that ghastly symbol torn down. There's a famous image of the guy hacking away with his hammer. Um, I've been to the Berlin Wall. It's Berlin is a fascinating city. I think it's one of the world's most interesting cities because it really has been on the forefront of history, arguably more so than any other city. Um, so the passing of Gorbachev is kind of symbolic because I mean, although he was an old man, he was 91. I think it's symbolic. Now he didn't outright condemn the invasion of Ukraine, but apparently he was very perturbed by it. Um, it's interesting that Putin didn't find something to sort of try and put Gorbachev into exile, but perhaps that was because Gorbachev wasn't that outspoken on Putinism. You know, he didn't. I don't think Putin really treated him as a domestic rival as such. Maybe because of his age, maybe because he was relatively muted. But clearly, two very different men. But it also goes to show that you can have totalitarian systems. A comparison with China would be in again in the late 80s, Hu Yaoping. Hu Yaoping was a reformer within the Chinese communist system, and his death sparked the protests of 1989 there. Of course, in China, the regime stayed in power and still stays in power. But even in totalitarian systems, I mean, hell, even in the Third Reich, um, I'm reluctant to say there were good Nazis, but there were members of the Nazi Party, Oskar Schindler, and others who, at some point, found their conscience, if I could put it that way. So even in totalitarian systems, you have people who are more practical and more humane, dare I say. Um, Putin is an Iceman. He is devoid, I think, of humanity. He's a thug, a gangster, a very powerful one. But sadly, I think the only way this ends is with his death, because he isn't going to step down quietly. I mean, I think that when Putin goes, there will be some sort of constitutional crisis in Russia. It could be like someone like Dmitry Medvedev or Sergei Lavrov take over, and they're hardliners as well. But I'm not sure if they have the personality clout that Putin has. Medvedev certainly doesn't. Lavrov, yeah, I mean he's the Kosygin, to Putin as Kosygin was to Brezhnev, I believe, or Khrushchev. Um, but that's it. Yeah. But rest in peace, Mikhail Gorbachev. I mean, I think it's important to consider just how hard his position was because he probably knew he would be condemned to history, but he said his victory was stepping down. Um, Recent years, a lot of big names have passed away. Nelson Mandela, 2013, Margaret Thatcher in 2013. I'm thinking of these big political names in my lifetime, but Gorbachev is definitely one of them. One of the most influential people of modern history. It's no exaggeration. Although he was actually in power for a relatively short time, 6 years, compared to, Stalin, Brezhnev, and Putin, all in power for decades. But Gorbachev certainly made his mark. And I just hope one day in Russia he gets perhaps a fairer assessment. I hope one day Russians will recognize that had he stayed in power, um, I was going to say we'd still have a Cold War. Well, we do. Putin's restarted it. I mean, I see the 90s with everything that's happened. I see the 1990s as sort of a brief intermission, maybe into the early 2000s. I don't know when this new Cold War began. I don't think it's controversial to say that at all, because relations right now between the West and Moscow are almost non-existent. So I really don't think it's controversial to say we are in a new Cold War, um, which means really 1991 to about, say, maybe around 2005, certainly in Britain with the the death of Alexander Lukashenko. Not Alexander Lukashenko. Big mistake there. Not I'm not talking about the Belarusian dictator. Um, dissident who was poisoned in London. Brain freeze. But anyway, probably around the mid 2000s. So really, that was a hiatus period, and we're back where we were. There may be few nuclear weapons today, but I actually think Putin's even more ruthless than Brezhnev and other communist hardliners. I think he's fairly dangerous. I think he's the most inhumane Russian leader since Stalin. Absolutely. Um, I mean, even if we look at Brezhnev, the invasion of Afghanistan was catastrophic. Heavy Soviet losses, Soviet war crimes there. But even they withdrew eventually. I think Putin is just going to fight to the end. Anyway, rest in peace, Mikhail Gorbachev.